My dog Rex stopped dead in his tracks about 50 meters from the waterhole, his hackles rising like he'd caught scent of a dingo. The old blue heeler had never refused water before, not even from the muddiest farm dam, but here he was backing away from what looked like the cleanest billabong I'd seen since arriving in this godforsaken corner of Western Australia 3 weeks ago. His ears flattened against his skull, and a low whine escaped his throat as he pressed his body close to the red earth. The sound made my skin prickle despite the blazing afternoon heat. "Don't even think about it, mate." The voice came from behind me, rough as sandpaper and carrying the weight of absolute certainty. I turned to see Bill Hartley approaching, the station manager, who'd given me directions to this sector yesterday. His weathered face was grim under the brim of his akubra, and sweat stains darkened his blue work shirt, despite the early hour. "That's Bunyip's Billabong. Nothing good ever comes from messing with that water." I wiped the sweat from my forehead with the back of my hand and squinted at the pristine pool. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly, turning the air into a shimmering wall of heat that made distant objects dance like mirages. My water bottles felt lighter than they should have after a morning of surveying in 40-degree temperatures, and my throat was already scratchy with thirst. "Looks clean enough to me." The words came out more defensive than I'd intended, but the sight of all that clear water was making my mouth feel like sandpaper. "Looks can kill you out here." Bill's tone was dead serious, and he moved closer, his boots crunching on the brittle grass that surrounded the billabong like a warning perimeter. "Ask anyone within 100 kilometers. That water's cursed, has been for as long as anyone can remember. Lost 3 good people to that hole in the past decade alone." Rex whined again and pressed against my legs, his entire body trembling with an anxiety I'd never seen in him before. The dog's nose twitched constantly, as if he was picking up scents that repulsed him, and his eyes never left the water's surface. I'd brought Rex from Perth partly for company, partly because locals had recommended a good cattle dog for outback work, but mostly because animals had better instincts than humans when it came to danger. His reaction was starting to make me genuinely uncomfortable, even as my rational mind catalogued the perfectly reasonable explanations for his behavior. Cursed how, exactly? I pulled out my geological survey map, the paper crackling in the dry air as I unfolded it. The waterhole wasn't even marked on the official charts, just a blue dot among dozens of others scattered across the vast pastoral lease. My fingers traced the contour lines around the area, noting the subtle depression that would naturally collect runoff water. Bill spat into the red dirt, the saliva disappearing instantly into the thirsty earth. "Don't mock what you don't understand, city boy. My grandfather warned me off this place when I was knee-high to a grasshopper, and his grandfather told him the same. Some places are just wrong, and this is one of them." The conviction in his voice was absolute, the kind of certainty that comes from generations of accumulated experience. He shifted his weight from foot to foot, and I noticed how his eyes never quite settled on the billabong itself, as if direct observation might somehow invite trouble. I'd heard variations of this conversation too many times already in my 3 weeks of surveying. Every billabong, every rock formation, every stand of ghost gums seemed to come with its own catalogue of supernatural warnings from the locals. As a geological surveyor with a master's degree from Curtin University, I'd learned to separate folklore from fact through years of methodical training. Water was water, rock was rock, and fear was just ignorance dressed up in tradition. "Right," I said, folding the map with deliberate precision. The paper crackled again as I tucked it back into my shirt pocket. "Well, I appreciate the warning, but I've got work to do." Bill shook his head slowly, his expression shifting from concern to resignation. He walked back toward his battered Toyota, his boots raising small puffs of red dust with each step. The vehicle's engine turned over reluctantly in the heat, coughing twice before settling into an unsteady idle. "Your funeral, mate. Just remember, I tried to tell you." The truck disappeared over the ridge in a cloud of red dust that hung in the still air like a warning flag. The silence that followed felt heavier than it should have, broken only by Rex's continued whining and the distant buzz of flies. I stood there for several minutes, studying the billabong from a safe distance while my dog pressed against my legs like he was trying to physically prevent me from moving closer to the water. The reason I'd ended up in this remote corner of the Pilbara had nothing to do with adventure, and everything to do with money that I desperately needed. Apex Mining had contracted me for a 6-week preliminary survey of the pastoral lease, looking for mineral deposits that might justify a larger exploration program. The pay was triple my usual rate, enough to clear the student loans that had been crushing me for 2 years and put a deposit on that flat in Fremantle I'd been eyeing in the rental listings. All I had to do was map the geological features, test soil and water samples, and file comprehensive reports on anything that looked promising from a mining perspective. What I hadn't expected was the locals' obsession with treating every natural feature like it housed malevolent spirits waiting to claim unwary visitors. The Billabong was just the latest example in a growing catalogue of supernatural warnings. In 3 weeks I'd been warned away from a perfectly ordinary granite outcrop that supposedly sang at certain times of year when the wind hit it just right. There was a dry creek bed where stock allegedly refused to graze, despite the presence of decent feed in the area. Now I had a waterhole that looked cleaner than most swimming pools, but carried a reputation for killing people who dared to use it. My curiosity about Bunyip's Billabong only deepened over the next few days as I surveyed the surrounding area, methodically mapping the geological features and taking soil samples from the nearby ridges. Every conversation seemed to circle back to the place, each local adding their own piece to the puzzle of its dark reputation. The stories followed a consistent pattern that was both reassuring in its logic and disturbing in its implications. At the roadhouse in Marble Bar, the cook, a sun-weathered woman named Dot, nearly dropped her coffee pot when I mentioned collecting water samples from the general area. Her hands shook as she set the pot back on the burner, and coffee grounds scattered across the cracked linoleum floor. "You went near that place?" "Christ almighty, what's wrong with you Southerners?" The question came out sharp and genuine, tinged with the kind of concern usually reserved for people who'd just announced their intention to juggle live snakes. "What exactly is supposed to be wrong with it?" I pressed, genuinely curious now about the consistency of the warnings, and the obvious fear they generated in otherwise practical people. Dot glanced around the empty dining room as if spirits might be eavesdropping from the dusty corners. Her eyes lingered on the windows, checking the parking lot like she expected to see something that shouldn't be there. My second cousin Tommy worked mustering cattle for the Hartley station back in '98. Strong as a Mallee bull, that boy, and smart too. Found him floating face down in that Billabong 3 days after he went missing. She wiped her hands on her apron repeatedly, a nervous gesture that left damp streaks on the faded fabric. Autopsy said he drowned, but Tommy could swim like a bloody fish. Grew up on the Murray River before his family moved north. People drown all the time, I pointed out, though the defensive tone in my voice suggested I was trying to convince myself as much as her. Even good swimmers can get into trouble if they're tired, disoriented, or dealing with unexpected conditions. "Not Tommy," she said firmly, her voice carrying the absolute certainty of someone who'd known the victim personally. "And not Janet Morrison in 2003, or that geologist fellow 5 years back. 3 deaths in 10 years, all the same, found floating in perfectly calm water, with no explanation for how they ended up there." Her fingers drummed against the counter as she spoke, a rapid tattoo that betrayed her nervousness. The mention of another geologist caught my attention like a fishhook, sharp and immediate. "What geologist?" "Some mining company sent him up here, just like you. Young bloke from down south, probably thought he knew better than the locals, just like you." Her eyes narrowed as she studied my face, looking for signs of the same arrogance she'd apparently seen before. Found him with his sampling equipment scattered all around the Billabong's edge, like he'd just walked in. Left his backpack, his GPS, even his satellite phone sitting there, like he'd planned to come right back. The image she painted was disturbingly specific, and I found myself unconsciously checking my own equipment as she spoke. That evening, I sat in my camp chair outside the caravan I'd parked at the Marble Bar Tourist Park, trying to make sense of the conflicting stories while the desert air finally began to cool. The sun hung low on the horizon, painting the landscape in shades of red and gold that would have been beautiful under other circumstances. My field notebook lay open on my lap, filled with 3 days' worth of conversations and warnings that painted an increasingly detailed picture of the Billabong's reputation. The rational part of my mind catalogued the likely explanations with scientific precision: accidental drownings, heat exhaustion leading to disorientation, possibly contaminated water affecting judgment or motor control. But the surveyor in me was intrigued by the patterns, the consistency of details across multiple unconnected sources. 3 deaths over 10 years suggested either an incredible string of coincidences or an environmental hazard that locals had mythologized into supernatural curse through generations of oral tradition. At the pub, I'd managed to extract more details from the bartender, a taciturn man named Dave who'd lived in the area his entire 50-odd years. His hands moved with practiced efficiency as he polished glasses, but his eyes had grown distant when I mentioned the Billabong. According to him, the Aboriginal people had always avoided the area, calling it a sorrow place, long before white settlement brought European superstitions to the region. The name Bunyip's Billabong apparently came from early pastoralists who'd heard the warnings and assumed they referred to the legendary water creature from Aboriginal folklore. Thing is, David said while polishing glasses with methodical precision, each movement deliberate and careful, the old people never mentioned any Bunyip when they warned about that place. That's southern mob stuff mostly. The warnings were about something else, something they wouldn't talk about with white fellas. His voice had carried the weight of conversations that had taken place over decades, fragments of knowledge passed along in careful whispers. But you've never seen anything yourself? Dave's pause lasted long enough to make me genuinely uncomfortable, his polishing cloth going still in his hands. Seen enough to stay away. Water's got a funny color sometimes, especially after rain when the runoff stirs things up, and the way animals act around it. He'd shrugged, but the gesture seemed forced, like he was deliberately cutting off a more detailed explanation. Smart money says listen to the wildlife. They don't have the luxury of being wrong about danger. By the 4th day I'd filled 3 pages of my field notebook with second-hand accounts, local warnings, and increasingly detailed theories. The stories varied in specifics, but agreed on essentials. The Billabong was dangerous, animals avoided it, and people who ignored the warnings had a disturbing tendency to end up dead. The pattern was compelling enough that I found myself driving past the site twice without stopping, slowing down just enough to observe it from the relative safety of the road. Each time, the water looked exactly the same, pristine, inviting, and completely ordinary except for the absolute silence that seemed to surround it. The scorching afternoon when I finally encountered the Billabong up close arrived without fanfare, just another day of relentless heat and methodical surveying work. I'd been mapping a series of low ridges to the east, following what looked like promising quartz intrusions through increasingly rough country. My GPS readings suggested possible mineral deposits in the area, the kind of geological formations that might justify Apex Mining's interest in a larger exploration program. Rex panted heavily in the meager shade of my survey tripod, his tongue lolling as he watched me take measurements and record GPS coordinates. The heat was brutal even by Pilbara standards, the kind of dry furnace that sucked moisture from exposed skin and made every breath feel like inhaling sand. My water consumption had been higher than planned, due to a miscalculation about distances and the unexpected difficulty of the terrain. The nearest marked waterhole was 6 kilometers back the way we'd come, a long trek, through increasingly rough country, under the blazing afternoon sun. But I remembered Bill Hartley's directions to Bunyip's Billabong, just 2 kilometers north, through a gap in the ridgeline that should provide relatively easy walking. Even cursed water could be boiled for drinking, and I carried purification tablets for exactly these situations. The rational part of my mind had already dismissed the supernatural warnings as folklore, but I planned to treat any water source with appropriate scientific caution. The Billabong appeared suddenly as Rex and I crested a low rise, revealed like a secret that the landscape had been hiding. My first impression was of unnatural perfection, a flawless oval of blue-green water nestled in a depression between weathered granite boulders. The surface was so still it looked like polished glass, reflecting the cloudless sky with mirror-like precision. I could see the sandy bottom clearly through at least 3 meters of water, the clarity so perfect it seemed almost artificial. No debris floated on the surface, no algae stained the edges, no insects disturbed the perfect reflection. Rex's reaction was immediate and unmistakable, more dramatic than his behavior during our first encounter. He stopped as if he'd hit an invisible barrier, his entire body going rigid with tension. A low whine escaped his throat, rising in pitch until it became almost inaudible, and he began backing away despite his obvious thirst. The hair along his spine stood up in a ridge of bristling fur, and his eyes rolled white as he kept glancing between me and the water. I'd never seen him display such obvious terror, not even during thunderstorms or encounters with aggressive cattle. The silence struck me with physical force, like walking into a wall of muffled sound. In 3 weeks of Outback work, I'd grown accustomed to the constant background noise of insects, birds, and small animals going about their daily business. Here the air seemed dead, as if sound itself was reluctant to travel across the water's surface. No flies buzzed near the water's edge despite the heat and humidity. No birds called from the surrounding trees, though I could see several species perched motionlessly in the branches. Even the wind seemed to die as it approached the Billabong, the constant breeze that provided minimal relief from the heat simply ceasing to exist within 50 meters of the water. I knelt at the water's edge, my boots sinking slightly into the surprisingly soft sand. The substrate felt different from normal Billabong sediment, finer and somehow more organic, though I couldn't identify what made it seem unusual. I dipped my hand into the water, and the temperature was perfect, cool but not cold, refreshing against my heat-stressed skin. There was no visible algae coating the rocks, no bacterial scum floating on the surface, no sign of the blooms that often plagued Outback waterholes during hot weather. The water felt slightly thicker than normal between my fingers, though that was probably imagination triggered by the strange circumstances. If anything, it looked more like a resort swimming pool than a natural water source, almost too clean to be believable. Rex refused to come closer than 10 meters, finding whatever shade he could under a stunted acacia, while watching me with obvious anxiety. His panting had become rapid and shallow, and he kept shifting his weight from foot to foot like he was preparing to run. His behavior bothered me more than I wanted to admit, challenging my rational dismissal of the local warnings. Dogs had evolutionary instincts for detecting danger that humans had largely bred out of themselves through centuries of civilization. If Rex sensed something fundamentally wrong with this place, dismissing his warning might be more than just unscientific, it might be genuinely dangerous. Still, my water situation was becoming critical, and the Billabong represented the closest reliable source. I filled one water bottle carefully, watching the clear liquid flow through the opening, without any of the usual debris or discoloration. I added 2 purification tablets, watching them dissolve, with the usual fizzing reaction, and screwed the cap back on tightly. The water felt somehow heavier than normal as I tucked the bottle into my pack, though that was obviously psychological suggestion triggered by all the warnings I'd heard. Water was water, regardless of where it came from, and proper chemical treatment would eliminate any reasonable biological hazards. The walk back to my vehicle seemed longer than it should have, with Rex staying unusually close to my heels instead of his normal ranging behavior. His ears remained flattened against his skull and he kept looking back toward the Billabong with an expression I'd never seen before. Twice I caught myself looking back as well, though I couldn't say what drew my attention. From a distance, the waterhole looked like any other feature of the landscape. Peaceful, inviting, a welcome splash of blue in the harsh red environment. But something about it seemed to pull at my peripheral vision, demanding attention I didn't want to give. That evening at the roadhouse, I mentioned my visit to Dot while she served up a plate of questionable steak and chips. The meat was overcooked and tough, the chips soggy with grease, but it was hot food after a long day in brutal conditions. Her reaction was immediate and dramatic, more intense than her previous warnings. "You what?" She nearly dropped the plate, catching it against her hip with a clatter that drew stares from the only other customers. "Jesus Christ, what's wrong with you? Did you drink any?" The panic in her voice was genuine, transforming her weathered features into a mask of real fear. "Just collected a sample," I said, pulling out my water bottle to demonstrate the scientific precautions I'd taken. The tablets had done their work over the course of the afternoon, and the water looked perfectly clear and safe. "See? Nothing supernatural about it. Just water with proper chemical treatment." Dot backed away from the table as if I'd produced a live snake, her hands raised defensively. "Get that bloody thing away from me. And don't you dare drink it, not if you've got any sense left." Her voice had risen enough to attract attention from the kitchen, and I could see curious faces peering through the service window. "It's just water, Dot, treated water at that. Chemical purification eliminates biological contaminants." "That's what they all thought," she muttered, retreating toward the kitchen with backward glances. "That's what they all bloody thought. Chemistry can't fix what's wrong with that place." Her reaction stayed with me through a restless night in the caravan park, where the air conditioning unit struggled against the retained heat of the day. The treated water sat on my small table, looking innocuous in the artificial light, but Dot's genuine terror had shaken my scientific confidence more than I wanted to admit. I found old Pete the next morning, not through any deliberate search but because he found me while I was setting up equipment near a promising quartz vein. The discovery had excited me initially. Visible gold traces in the exposed rock face suggested this area might justify serious mining attention. I was adjusting my survey tripod when a voice behind me said, "You're the mining fellow been asking about Bunyip's Billabong." The statement carried absolute certainty, as if my identity and purpose were written in my posture and equipment. The man standing 20 meters away looked like he'd been carved from the landscape itself, skin like leather that had been worked and weathered by decades of harsh conditions. His white beard was stained yellow from roll-your-own cigarettes, and his eyes were the color of faded denim, pale but penetrating. He wore the uniform of the long-time station hand, moleskin trousers faded to gray, a checked shirt with sweat stains under the arms, and boots that had seen decades of hard country. "Pete Morrison," he said, extending a hand that felt like shaking a tree root, all knots and calluses. "Been working stations in this country for 43 years. Heard you've been collecting stories about that waterhole." His grip was firm despite his apparent age, and his eyes never left mine during the introduction. "News travels fast out here. Not much else to talk about in a place like this." Pete pulled out tobacco and papers, beginning the ritual of rolling a cigarette with movements so practiced they seemed automatic. His fingers worked the tobacco with the skill of someone who'd been performing the same motions for decades. "Mind if I share some advice? The kind that might keep you alive long enough to spend whatever they're paying you." I gestured to a nearby boulder that provided some shade, and we both sat in the narrow band of relief cast by my vehicle. The metal was already hot to the touch despite the early hour, and heat waves were beginning to rise from the exposed surfaces. Rex, who'd been wary of strangers since our Billabong visit, immediately trotted over to Pete for attention. The transformation was remarkable. The dog's anxiety disappeared completely, replaced by his normal friendly curiosity. Apparently whatever spooked him about the waterhole didn't extend to weathered station hands who'd spent their lives in this country. "My grandfather worked this country when it was still genuine frontier," Pete began, lighting his smoke with a battered Zippo. The flame flickered in the slight breeze, and he cupped his hands protectively around it. Mixed up with Aboriginal folks more than most white men of his time, learned some of their ways and their warnings. They told him things about that Billabong that stuck with him his whole life. The tobacco smoke drifted away in the dry air, carrying the familiar scent of a habit that had probably started in his teens. "What kind of things?" Pete took a long drag and squinted at the horizon, his eyes tracking the heat mirages that made distant hills dance like liquid. "They called it death water, not because of any bunyip or spirit creature, like the pastoralists thought, but because of what it did to people who used it. Said it would steal your thoughts, make you forget which way was up, turn your own mind against you." His voice carried the weight of conversations that had taken place decades ago, fragments of knowledge passed down through generations. They'd lost people to it over the years, enough to make the whole area taboo, not just dangerous, forbidden. This was more specific than anything I'd heard before, and I found myself leaning forward despite the heat. "How exactly did people die?" "Same way they die now, walking into the water and not coming back out." Pete's voice carried the weight of personal experience, and his hands shook slightly as he raised the cigarette. "My niece Janet was one of them. Worked as a nurse in Port Hedland, smart as a whip, scared of nothing that walked, crawled, or slithered. Came up here in 2003 to visit me, decided to take a walk one evening, while I was fixing a windmill pump." He paused, staring at the ember on his cigarette, as if it might contain answers to questions he'd been asking for years. "Found her the next morning, floating face down in that Billabong like she'd just decided to take a swim and forgotten how. No signs of struggle, no injuries, just gone." "I'm sorry for your loss," I said, meaning it. The pain in his voice was genuine and immediate, as if the death had happened yesterday rather than years ago. "But people can get disoriented in the heat, especially if they're not used to. Janet grew up in this country." Pete cut me off, his voice sharp with defensive certainty. "Spent every school holiday on stations from here to Broome. She knew water safety better than most blokes twice her age, could swim like a fish, and read weather patterns like a book." He flicked ash into the dirt where it disappeared immediately into the thirsty ground. "And she wasn't the first. Tommy Henderson in 98, Marcus Webb in 2010. All of them good bushmen, all of them found the same way. Floating in calm water with no explanation for how they got there." The name Marcus Webb rang a bell. Dot had mentioned a geologist, and the timeline fit. Webb was the mining surveyor? Worked for some mob out of Perth, doing the same job you're doing now. Pete's eyes fixed on mine with uncomfortable intensity. Heard he'd been asking about the Billabong too, collecting samples and taking measurements, treating the local warnings like primitive superstition. They found his equipment scattered around the water's edge, like he'd just dropped everything and walked in. Something cold moved in my stomach despite the rising heat of the morning. The parallel was too close for comfort. Another geologist, another mining survey, another man who'd dismissed local warnings in favor of scientific rationalism. Did anyone investigate? Police, coroner? Course they did. All 3 deaths ruled accidental drowning. No signs of foul play, no obvious cause for disorientation, no evidence of struggle or external injury. Pete dropped his cigarette butt and ground it under his heel with more force than necessary. Just 3 healthy adults who apparently forgot how to swim in perfectly calm water. Case closed, nothing to see here. But the old Aboriginal fellows, the ones who still remember the stories, they knew what happened. The water got them, same as it's been getting people for longer than anyone wants to count. What do you mean, the water got them? Pete was quiet for so long I thought he might not answer. His eyes scanned the horizon as if looking for something that might be watching us, and his weathered hands fidgeted with his tobacco pouch. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that made Rex's ears prick up. Aboriginal people said the water was poison. Not poison like you'd think of it, but poison to the mind. Made people see things that weren't there, forget things that were. Like the water was alive somehow, calling to them. He stood and brushed dust from his moleskins, preparing to leave. Course, that's just blackfella superstition according to most folks. What would they know about the country they lived in for 40,000 years? The irony in his voice was thick as treacle, challenging my own assumptions about primitive knowledge versus scientific understanding. I watched him walk back toward his dusty Hilux, noting the way he moved with the careful efficiency of someone who'd spent decades in harsh country. Why are you telling me this? Pete paused with his hand on the door handle, turning back with an expression that mixed concern with resignation. Because I liked Janet, and I liked Marcus Webb too when I met him. Both of them smart, both of them careful, both of them dead because they thought they knew better than the old warnings. His faded eyes met mine with uncomfortable directness. And because you've got the same look they had, like you're trying to solve a puzzle that's been claiming lives since before your great-grandfather was born. The truck's engine coughed to life with a sound like grinding metal, and Pete leaned out the window for a final word. Some mysteries aren't meant to be solved, son. Some places are meant to be left alone. The smart money listens to warnings that have kept people alive for generations. As his dust plume disappeared over the ridge, I found myself staring at the water bottle I'd filled at the Billabong. The treated water looked perfectly clear, perfectly safe, identical to hundreds of samples I'd collected over the years, but Pete's words echoed in my mind, poison to the mind. What if the locals were right about the danger, just wrong about the supernatural explanation? What if there was something in that water, some natural toxin or chemical compound that affected human cognition in ways that standard field testing couldn't detect? For the first time since arriving in this remote corner of the Outback, I began to wonder if my scientific skepticism might be a liability rather than an asset. 3 people had died at that Billabong in 12 years, all under remarkably similar circumstances. That wasn't superstition. That was data. And data demanded investigation rather than dismissal. That evening, I drove back to town with a new sense of purpose, my scientific curiosity finally aligned with the mystery rather than opposed to it. I cleaned out the shelves at Mackenzie's general store, buying every piece of water testing equipment their limited inventory could offer. pH strips, bacterial test kits, chemical analysis tablets, even a basic microscope kit designed for field use. The store clerk, a teenager who looked bored beyond measure, perked up at the unusual sale. You doing some kind of science project? He asked while ringing up the purchases. Something like that, I said, not wanting to explain the full situation. Back in my motel room, I spread the supplies across the scratched formica table, like a chemist preparing for the most important analysis of his career. The single fluorescent bulb cast harsh light across the equipment, and the air conditioning unit rattled against the retained heat of the day. The water sample from Bunyip's Billabong looked innocent enough in the plastic bottle, catching the artificial light like liquid crystal. I started with the basics, following the methodical approach I'd learned in university laboratories. pH came back normal at 7.2, slightly alkaline, but well within safe parameters for natural spring water. Nitrates, phosphates, chlorides, all within expected ranges for groundwater in this geological region. The bacterial test strips showed no signs of contamination, no evidence of the harmful organisms that typically made natural water sources dangerous. "Bloody hell," I muttered, checking the results twice and then a third time. According to every test I could perform with basic equipment, the water was not just safe, it was remarkably pure, cleaner than most municipal supplies. But 3 people were dead, and their deaths shared an undeniable pattern that couldn't be explained by coincidence or carelessness. I spread my geological surveys across the narrow bed, correlating them with the hand-drawn maps old Pete had sketched for me during our conversation. The Billabong sat in a natural depression where 3 minor fault lines intersected, fed by an underground spring system that reached deep into the Great Artesian Basin. The geological formations were complex, but not unusual for the region: sandstone and shale layers with granite intrusions, exactly the kind of structure that created natural springs throughout the Pilbara. Over the next 3 days, I made increasingly detailed trips to the site, each time pushing a little further past the invisible boundary my rational mind had established. I collected soil samples from different depths around the perimeter, noting the unusual mineral staining that created rainbow patterns in the red earth. The rock formations showed heavy iron oxide deposits typical of the region, but also something else: a greenish-black staining that didn't match any standard geological references I carried. My portable conductivity meter revealed anomalous readings that became more pronounced the closer I got to the water. While surface measurements appeared normal, deeper readings showed irregular electromagnetic signatures, as if something beneath the Billabong was interfering with the equipment. The interference followed no pattern I could identify, fluctuating seemingly at random but always present to some degree. Twice, my GPS unit malfunctioned completely when I approached the water's edge. Its display would scramble into meaningless symbols before shutting down entirely, forcing me to restart the device away from the Billabong. Equipment failure, I told myself, but the explanations felt increasingly hollow. High-quality surveying instruments didn't simply malfunction without identifiable cause, and the pattern was too consistent to be coincidental. There had to be something in the local environment, mineral deposits, magnetic anomalies, underground metal concentrations, that was affecting sensitive electronics in ways I didn't understand. The obsession grew like a fever, consuming my thoughts and driving me to return to the site every morning before the heat became unbearable. I found myself setting up increasingly sophisticated monitoring stations around the perimeter, borrowing equipment from contacts in Perth and Brisbane. A friend's metal detector arrived by overnight courier, and I was certain that buried ore deposits or underground pipes might explain the electromagnetic interference. The device screamed constantly near the water, its audio alerts so intense I had to turn down the sensitivity to avoid damaging my hearing. But excavation revealed nothing but more of that strange greenish-black mineral staining, and the metallic readings seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. My field notes became increasingly frantic, filled with measurements and observations that painted a picture of something genuinely unusual but frustratingly inexplicable. The water temperature remained constant regardless of air temperature or time of day, exactly 18.6 degrees Celsius, even during the scorching afternoon heat that drove surface temperatures above 50 degrees. The clarity never varied, never showed the algae blooms or seasonal changes typical of natural water bodies in the region. Even during brief rain showers, the water remained crystal clear while every other water source in the area turned muddy with runoff. Most disturbing were my own physiological responses, which I documented with scientific precision even as they began to genuinely worry me. Prolonged exposure to the site left me feeling disoriented and nauseated, with symptoms that persisted for hours after leaving the area. My sleep became restless and fragmented, filled with dreams of dark water and voices speaking languages I couldn't understand, but somehow recognized. I attributed these symptoms to heat exhaustion and the stress of working in challenging conditions, but the pattern was too consistent to ignore. By the end of the first week of intensive investigation, I had moved my base camp to within half a kilometer of the Billabong. The isolation should have concerned me. My satellite phone worked sporadically at best, cutting out whenever I tried to report my preliminary findings to Brisbane. But instead of worry, I felt protection, as if the Billabong had become my secret to unravel, my mystery to solve without interference from skeptical supervisors. The equipment malfunctions intensified as I spent more time near the site. My digital camera captured strange artifacts in photos of the water, geometric patterns and light distortions that looked almost like interference from radio transmissions. The battery in my laptop drained in hours instead of its usual 8-hour cycle, and the screen would flicker with static when I tried to analyze the data I'd collected. Even my mechanical wristwatch, a reliable Swiss timepiece that had survived 3 years of fieldwork without missing a beat, began losing time whenever I approached the water's edge. Still, I persisted with growing determination. The rational part of my mind knew I was exhibiting classic symptoms of obsessive behavior, but the scientist in me couldn't abandon the investigation. 3 people had died here under mysterious circumstances, and I was closer than anyone had ever come to understanding why. The answers lay in the water, in the soil, in the complex geological systems beneath Bunyip's Billabong. I just needed more time, better equipment, more comprehensive analysis to crack the mystery that had claimed 3 lives. It was on a Tuesday morning, as I knelt at the water's edge collecting what must have been my 20th sample, that everything went catastrophically wrong. The day was already hot, despite the early hour, with the sun climbing toward what promised to be another scorching afternoon. I had been working for several hours without adequate water breaks, too focused on my measurements to pay proper attention to my own hydration needs. My vision seemed unusually sharp, the colors around the Billabong more vivid than normal, as if someone had adjusted the contrast settings on reality itself. The water appeared to pulse with an internal light, beautiful and hypnotic, more appealing than any natural water source had a right to be. I leaned forward to fill another sample bottle, and the world tilted sideways without warning. The clear water suddenly looked inviting beyond reason, refreshing, essential to my continued existence. My mouth felt dry as sandpaper, and the logical voice warning about contamination grew fainter against the immediate need to drink, to cool myself, to sink into that perfect, crystalline clarity. I found myself wading into the Billabong without any memory of making the decision. The water was still clutched in my left hand as I moved deeper, water rising past my knees toward my waist. The temperature was exactly as my instruments had recorded, 18.6 degrees, but it felt like liquid paradise against my overheated skin. Heaven. Perfect. Home. Rex was barking frantically from the shore, but the sound seemed to come from very far away, muffled by the strange clarity that had settled over my thoughts. The water reached my chest, and I realized with detached curiosity that I couldn't remember deciding to enter the Billabong. My field notes lay scattered on the bank behind me, pages fluttering in the morning breeze like abandoned prayers. I took another step forward, and my boots lost contact with the sandy bottom. The water was deeper than I had calculated, deeper than any of my careful measurements had indicated. I was floating now, drifting toward the center of the Billabong, and the part of my brain that should have been screaming warnings felt strangely quiet and content. It was the taste of water in my mouth that finally triggered genuine alarm. I was swallowing the Billabong water, gulping it down like a man dying of thirst in the desert. The flavor was clean, pure, perfect, and absolutely wrong according to every safety protocol I'd ever learned. This was the water that had killed 3 people, the water I had spent days analyzing and testing and treating with scientific caution. Panic hit like an electric shock, cutting through the strange contentment that had settled over my thoughts. I thrashed toward shore, fighting against limbs that felt heavy as lead, and lungs that burned with each labored breath. The water seemed to thicken around me, resistant to movement, reluctant to let me escape its crystalline embrace. Rex's barking grew more frantic and closer, and I followed the sound like a lifeline thrown to a drowning man. My boots finally found purchase on the muddy bottom, and I stumbled toward the bank on legs that barely supported my weight. The transition from water to land felt like crossing into a different world, one where normal physics applied, and thoughts moved at their usual speed. I collapsed in the red dirt beside my scattered equipment, vomiting Billabong water and bile, while Rex whined and nuzzled my face with desperate concern. The dog's tongue was rough and warm against my skin, anchoring me to reality after what felt like a journey to somewhere else entirely. The whole episode couldn't have lasted more than 5 minutes, but it felt like I had been underwater for hours. My skin was pale and wrinkled like I'd spent too long in a bath, and my core temperature was dangerously low, despite the rising heat of the morning. Worse, My memory of the event felt fractured and dreamlike, as if I had experienced it through someone else's eyes or while under the influence of powerful drugs. I managed to load my gear into the vehicle with hands that shook like an old man's, fighting waves of nausea and disorientation. The drive back to town was a nightmare of dizziness and confusion, with the landscape seeming to shift and waver around me like a mirage. Twice, I had to pull over to vomit beside the road, bringing up more water than seemed possible given the brief time I'd spent in the Billabong. My hands shook so badly I could barely grip the steering wheel, and by the time I reached the clinic, I was running a fever and seeing double. The nurse who greeted me at the reception desk was perhaps 35, with the kind of practical beauty that belonged to women who had grown up in hard country and learned to take care of themselves. Her name tag read, Sarah Mackenzie, and she took one look at my condition before guiding me straight to an examination room without bothering with paperwork or insurance questions. "Let me guess," she said, checking my pulse and temperature with efficient, practiced movements. Her hands were cool and steady, a welcome contrast to my own trembling. "Bunyip's Billabong." I nodded weakly, surprised by her immediate recognition but too sick to be curious about how she'd known. "How did you know?" "Because you're the third person this year who's come in with these exact symptoms after spending time out there." Sarah wrapped a blood pressure cuff around my arm, her expression serious and professional. "The other two had enough sense to stay away from the water itself. You actually went in, didn't you?" The accusation in her voice was gentle, but unmistakable, and I found myself nodding again like a guilty child. She was old Pete's niece, I learned as she administered IV fluids and monitored my recovery over the next several hours. Unlike her uncle, Sarah had medical training and a scientific background that made her skeptical of supernatural explanations while remaining respectful of local knowledge and traditional warnings. Her approach was exactly what I needed. Rational, but not dismissive, scientific, but informed by practical experience. "Pete told me you'd been asking questions about the Billabong," she said, settling into the chair beside my bed once my vital signs had stabilized. "He's worried about you, says you have the same look the others had before they died. Obsessed, he called it, like you'd found something worth risking your life for." "I nearly drowned this morning," I admitted, the words coming out easier than I'd expected. But not from the water depth or any normal swimming hazard. Something else happened. Confusion, disorientation, like I'd been drugged. I walked into the Billabong without meaning to, without even realizing what I was doing, until it was almost too late. Sarah nodded grimly, unsurprised by the account. "That matches the pattern exactly. All three victims were found in the water, under circumstances that didn't make sense to anyone who knew them. Good swimmers, experienced bushmen, people who knew better than to take stupid risks with water safety." "But the water test's clean," I protested, clinging to the scientific analysis that had become my anchor in an increasingly confusing situation. "Every analysis I've run shows it's perfectly safe by normal standards." "Better than safe, it's remarkably pure, standard tests, right? pH, bacteria, basic contamination indicators?" When I nodded, Sarah continued with the tone of someone who'd been thinking about this problem for a long time. "What about toxic algae?" "Blue-green algae blooms can produce neurotoxins that cause exactly the symptoms you described: confusion, hallucinations, loss of motor control, respiratory distress." "But there's no visible algae in the Billabong," I said. "The water is completely clear, cleaner than any natural source I've ever seen." "Cyanobacteria can be microscopic," Sarah explained patiently. "And some species only become toxic under specific environmental conditions: temperature changes, barometric pressure variations, chemical triggers from underground springs. The toxins themselves are nearly impossible to detect without specialized laboratory equipment that most field operations don't carry." The theory made immediate sense, more sense than anything I had considered during my weeks of investigation. Toxic algae would explain the periodic deaths, the neurological symptoms I'd experienced, even the equipment malfunctions, if the organisms produced electromagnetic effects as part of their biological processes. "There's another possibility," Sarah continued, her voice dropping to a more confidential tone. "Gas emissions from underground sources. The Billabong sits on fault lines, right? Geological surveys sometimes miss underground gas seeps, especially intermittent ones that only activate under specific conditions." She leaned forward, her medical training evident in the systematic way she approached the problem. Carbon dioxide, hydrogen sulfide, even methane. They can all cause confusion and disorientation in the right concentrations. People exposed to gas leaks often report feeling drunk or euphoric before the more serious symptoms kick in. I struggled to sit up despite the lingering effects of whatever had affected me at the Billabong, my mind racing with the implications. Gas emissions would explain the equipment failures, the electromagnetic interference, even the constant water temperature if there's geothermal activity involved. And they'd explain why the deaths seem random, Sarah added. Gas seeps often follow weather patterns, barometric pressure changes, seasonal shifts, storm activity. The Billabong might only be dangerous under specific atmospheric conditions that occur irregularly. For the first time in days, I felt like I was approaching real answers rather than stumbling through an increasingly bizarre mystery. The scientific method was reasserting itself, providing rational frameworks for phenomena that had seemed supernatural or inexplicable. I need to get back out there, I said, swinging my legs over the edge of the examination bed, with proper equipment, this time. Gas detectors, atmospheric monitoring gear. Like hell you do. Sarah's voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to dealing with stubborn patients who thought they knew better than medical advice. You nearly died this morning. Whatever is happening at that Billabong, it's not worth your life or anyone else's. But if we can identify the specific cause, toxic algae, gas emissions, whatever it is, we can save other people from the same fate, I argued. Those 3 deaths don't have to be meaningless. We can turn this tragedy into prevention. Sarah studied me for a long moment, her expression shifting from medical professional to something more personal and conflicted. You're not going to let this go, are you? Even after what happened to you this morning, would you? I asked, meeting her eyes directly. If you had the training and equipment to potentially solve a mystery that's been killing people for years. She sighed, running her hands through her dark hair in a gesture of resignation mixed with determination. No, I suppose I wouldn't, but if we're going to do this, we do it right. Proper safety equipment, communication protocols, someone who knows the medical side of toxic exposure standing by. We? You'll need a partner, Sarah said simply. And I've been wondering about those deaths for 2 years now, ever since I started working at this clinic. Maybe it's time someone with medical training took a closer look at what's really happening out there. 3 days later, Sarah and I returned to the Billabong with proper equipment that turned our investigation into something resembling a professional hazardous materials assessment. Gas detectors, water testing kits designed for toxic substances, portable weather monitoring gear, and most importantly, emergency breathing apparatus that could provide clean air if atmospheric conditions became dangerous. The morning was still and overcast, with the kind of atmospheric pressure that made my ears feel stuffed with cotton and created an oppressive sense of impending weather change. The air felt thick and heavy, charged with electricity that hadn't yet manifested as visible storm clouds. Readings are already elevated, Sarah reported, checking the gas detector as we approached the water's edge with careful, measured steps. The device beeped intermittently, its digital display showing numbers that fluctuated but remained consistently above normal background levels. Carbon dioxide levels are nearly twice normal atmospheric concentration, and there's definitely hydrogen sulfide present. Not immediately dangerous, but enough to cause symptoms with prolonged exposure. I knelt by the Billabong's rim, watching the surface that had nearly claimed my life just days earlier. In the grey morning light, it looked deceptively ordinary, just another waterhole in the endless Outback landscape. But the gas detector's intermittent beeping told a different story, providing scientific validation for warnings that had been dismissed as superstition. Look at this, I said, pointing to hairline fractures in the bedrock beneath the water that were visible through the crystalline clarity. The geological survey maps didn't show this level of detail, but you can see the fault structure clearly from here. These cracks go deep, probably connecting to underground systems we never mapped. Sarah waded in carefully, staying in the shallows while monitoring her handheld detector with professional attention. The concentrations are higher near the center, and they're fluctuating in a pattern. It's not constant emission. The gases are pulsing based on some kind of pressure variation underground. We spent the morning methodically mapping the gas seepage patterns, correlating them with wind direction, barometric pressure, and water temperature measurements. The picture that emerged was both elegant and terrifying in its deadly simplicity. The Billabong sat atop an active geological seep, where underground pressure changes, triggered by weather patterns, seasonal shifts, even distant seismic activity, periodically released concentrated pockets of toxic gas into the atmosphere around the water. "This explains everything," Sarah said as we compiled our readings into a coherent scientific picture. "On calm days with high barometric pressure, the gases get trapped near the water surface instead of dispersing into the atmosphere. Anyone who lingers here would gradually succumb to carbon dioxide narcosis and hydrogen sulfide poisoning. The symptoms would perfectly mimic accidental drowning," I added, remembering my own disorienting experience and how close I'd come to becoming another unexplained fatality. Confusion, respiratory distress, loss of motor control. By the time someone realizes they're in danger, they're already too impaired to escape effectively. The elegance of the solution felt deeply satisfying, like completing a complex equation that had been missing crucial variables. We had identified the mechanism behind the Billabong's deadly reputation, explained the seemingly supernatural occurrences with measurable, repeatable science. The Aboriginal warnings, the local superstitions, the mysterious deaths, all could be traced to a simple geological phenomenon that periodically turned this waterhole into an invisible death trap. But as we prepared to pack our equipment and return to town with our breakthrough findings, Sarah's gas detector began beeping more rapidly. "Pressure's dropping fast," she said, checking her weather monitor with growing concern. "There's a major storm system moving in from the west, and if I'm reading these atmospheric changes correctly, it's going to be a big one." I looked up at the sky, noting how the overcast had darkened dramatically while we worked, too focused on our scientific investigation to pay proper attention to changing weather conditions. The air felt increasingly thick and heavy, charged with the kind of electric tension that precedes severe weather in the Outback. "We should head back immediately," Sarah said. But even as she spoke, the first distant rumble of thunder reached us across the empty landscape. The storm hit with the sudden, overwhelming violence that characterizes severe Outback weather systems. One moment we were methodically packing equipment under threatening but manageable clouds. The next we were caught in a deluge of rain and howling wind that reduced visibility to mere meters. Lightning strobed across the landscape in brilliant, disorienting flashes that left after images burned into our retinas. "The vehicle!" Sarah shouted over the wind, but I could barely make out her words above the roaring chaos. The storm had transformed our familiar surroundings into an alien landscape of driving rain and electrical fury that made navigation nearly impossible. We stumbled toward where we had parked the Land Rover, but the combination of torrential rain and unfamiliar terrain in the sudden artificial darkness made every step treacherous. Every lightning flash revealed a slightly different configuration of rocks and scrub, as if the landscape itself was shifting and changing around us with each illumination. "The gas readings are spiking dangerously," Sarah called, her voice barely audible above the storm's fury. "The pressure change is forcing massive amounts up through the seep. We need to get away from the water immediately." But in the chaos and disorientation of the storm, I had completely lost track of where the Billabong was in relation to our current position. The rain had turned the ground into a treacherous mixture of mud and hidden obstacles that made every step a gamble against twisted ankles or concealed holes. Then the hallucinations began with terrifying intensity. At first, I attributed the strange shadows and moving shapes to lightning effects and rain distortion, natural phenomena amplified by the chaos of severe weather. But as we struggled through the storm, the illusions became more pronounced and undeniably real to my compromised senses. I saw figures in the rain, tall, impossible silhouettes that beckoned from the darkness between lightning flashes. Sarah's face seemed to change when the strobing light illuminated her, aging decades in an instant before returning to normal, creating a disorienting sense that reality itself was unreliable. "The gas concentrations are reaching toxic levels," she gasped, struggling with her detector as rain poured down her face. "The storm pressure is forcing massive amounts up through the geological seep. We're walking through a toxic cloud that's getting more concentrated by the minute." I understood then that we were experiencing the Billabong's curse under the worst possible conditions, exactly the circumstances that had probably claimed previous victims. The same geological forces that had killed 3 people were now amplified by the storm, creating lethal gas concentrations across a much wider area than we had anticipated in our careful daytime measurements. My legs felt increasingly unsteady, and my thoughts seemed to move through thick syrup rather than at their normal speed. Sarah grabbed my arm, pulling me in what I hoped was the direction away from the water, but in my growing confusion, I couldn't be sure she wasn't leading us deeper into danger. The hallucinations intensified with each step. I saw old Pete standing in the rain, shaking his head sadly as if to say he had warned me about this exact situation. The shapes in the darkness became more defined, tall angular forms that my gas-addled brain interpreted as the Bunyip itself, the creature of Aboriginal legend rising from its cursed waterhole to claim new victims. "Stay with me." Sarah's voice seemed to come from very far away, though she was right beside me holding my arm. "We have to keep moving away from the source. Don't trust what you're seeing. The gas is affecting your perception of reality." But moving was becoming increasingly difficult with each labored step. The hydrogen sulfide was affecting my respiratory system, making each breath feel inadequate, while the carbon dioxide narcosis made every step feel like walking through deep water or thick mud. I stumbled and fell, my hands splashing into what I realized with absolute terror was the edge of the Billabong itself. We had been walking in circles, the storm and gas exposure combining to completely destroy our sense of direction. The cursed waterhole had drawn us back like some malevolent magnet, exactly as it had probably drawn its previous victims in their final confused moments. Sarah hauled me away from the water's edge with strength I didn't know she possessed, her medical training probably providing clarity that my scientific background couldn't match under these conditions. "The breathing apparatus," she shouted, fumbling for the emergency equipment we had brought as a safety precaution. "Put it on now." The small oxygen canister provided blessed relief, clearing my head enough to realize the full extent of our deadly predicament. We were trapped near the most dangerous area during peak gas emission, in the middle of a violent storm, with limited emergency air supplies and no reliable way to navigate to safety. "Follow the fence line," Sarah said, her own breathing apparatus muffling her words but providing the mental clarity we both desperately needed. "If we can find the boundary fence, we can follow it back to the road. It's our only reliable landmark in this chaos." We set out into the storm again, this time with clearer heads but dwindling oxygen reserves that added time pressure to our escape attempt. The fence posts appeared and disappeared in the lightning flashes like breadcrumbs in a deadly fairy tale, our only connection to a world that operated by normal rules of cause and effect. Each step was a conscious effort against the lingering effects of gas exposure and the storm's continuing disorienting fury. When we finally reached the Land Rover after what felt like hours of stumbling through hell, both of us collapsed against its rain-streaked sides. We gasped the cleaner air that the wind provided, our emergency oxygen supplies exhausted but our lives preserved by preparation and luck in equal measure. The storm was beginning to move past us, but its passage had demonstrated the Billabong's true danger with terrifying clarity that no amount of daytime investigation could have revealed. 2 days later, we presented our findings to the regional authorities in town, armed with scientific data that finally explained the mysterious deaths that had plagued the area for years. The geological survey team that responded to our report confirmed everything we had discovered: active gas seeps, dangerous emission levels under specific atmospheric conditions, and a clear correlation between the recorded deaths and periods of high seepage activity. Our measurements and documentation provided the evidence needed to take official action to protect future visitors to the area. Within a week, the Billabong area was officially designated as a geological hazard site. Warning signs were posted around the perimeter, and the location was marked on regional safety maps as dangerous during certain weather conditions. The rational, scientific explanation had triumphed over superstition and folklore, replacing mysterious curses with measurable atmospheric hazards. But the local reaction was not what I had expected from people who had lived with the Billabong's deadly reputation for generations. "Signs won't change anything that matters," old Pete said when I found him at the pub to share our findings and the official response they had generated. "That place has been dangerous since before white folks ever came to this country. Aboriginal people knew to stay away, and they didn't need gas detectors to figure out why." "But now we understand the specific mechanism," I protested, still believing that knowledge could translate directly into safety. "We can predict when conditions will be hazardous, warn people before atmospheric conditions create dangerous gas concentrations." "You can predict when your machines say it's dangerous," Pete interrupted, his weathered face showing patient disagreement. "But that waterhole has moods and patterns your instruments can't measure. Some places in this country are older and stranger than science wants to admit, and they don't follow the schedules your equipment predicts." His words stayed with me as I prepared to leave the area and return to the city, my surveying work complete, and the mining company satisfied with my geological assessments. But something fundamental had changed in my understanding of the relationship between knowledge and wisdom, between scientific explanation and lived experience that had kept people alive for generations. Sarah walked with me to the Land Rover on my final morning in town, both of us carrying the bond that comes from surviving genuine danger together. "Do you really think we solved it?" she asked, her medical training making her naturally skeptical of simple answers to complex problems. "We explained the mechanism," I said carefully, choosing my words with the precision that scientific accuracy demanded. "Gas emissions, toxic concentrations, atmospheric pressure variations, it all fits the evidence and provides a framework for understanding what's been happening. But..." I look back toward the direction of the Billabong, hidden behind the rolling hills and scattered scrub but still present in my thoughts. But I keep thinking about what Pete said about the Aboriginal people who first warned against that place. They didn't need to understand gas seeps or atmospheric chemistry to know it was deadly. They developed their superstitions and taboos through generations of careful observation and hard-won experience. "Survival wisdom disguised as folklore," Sarah nodded, understanding the distinction I was trying to articulate. Maybe the curse was just their way of ensuring people stayed alive without needing to understand the technical details. "And maybe some mysteries serve a protective purpose even when they're solved," I said, putting into words a thought that had been growing stronger each day. The scientific explanation makes us feel like we've conquered the unknown, but it doesn't actually make that waterhole any less dangerous to people who ignore the warnings. As I drove away from town for the last time, I thought about the fine line between rational skepticism and dangerous arrogance that had nearly cost me my life. I had come to the Outback as a confident professional who dismissed local superstitions as ignorant folklore waiting to be replaced by proper scientific understanding. I was leaving with a deeper respect for the accumulated wisdom that keeps people alive in harsh and unforgiving places, regardless of whether that wisdom comes wrapped in scientific terminology or traditional stories. The Billabong's curse was real in every way that mattered, even if we could now explain it in terms of geological processes and atmospheric chemistry. The waterhole was still dangerous, still claimed lives under the right conditions, still deserved the respect and caution that local people had always shown it. My final report to the mining company included detailed warnings about the geological hazards in the area, recommendations for gas monitoring protocols, and strong advisories about weather-dependent safety conditions. But I also included something unusual for a technical document, a paragraph about the importance of consulting local knowledge and respecting traditional warnings, even when the underlying mechanisms weren't immediately clear to outside observers with scientific training. Some mysteries are better left unsolved, not because they can't be explained, but because the explanation can create a false sense of security that proves more dangerous than the original fear. Understanding why the Billabong was dangerous didn't make it safe. It just gave us a different vocabulary for describing an ancient threat that had been claiming lives long before anyone could measure parts per million of hydrogen sulfide. To anyone who might follow in my footsteps, working in remote areas where local people offer warnings about dangerous places, I would say this: listen to the stories, respect the taboos, and remember that survival wisdom often wears the mask of superstition. The Outback has been teaching hard lessons about hidden dangers for thousands of years, and the smart money says those lessons are worth learning, whether you call them curses or gas seeps. The Bunyip's Billabong is still there, still claiming the occasional victim who ignores the warning signs, both official and traditional. Some places earn their dark reputations through simple, measurable dangers that science can explain and predict. That doesn't make them any less deadly, or any less deserving of the fear that keeps people alive. Rex still won't go near water that doesn't smell right to him, and I've learned to trust his instincts as much as my instruments. Sometimes the oldest warnings are the most reliable, and the smartest thing a scientist can do is listen to the wisdom that survived long enough to save lives. If you've ever driven the long roads at night, you know the silence that settles over places where the rules are different. Hit like and subscribe, more stories from the deep country are coming.